Welcome to Center Stage. My name is Mark Gordon. Kingdom of Shadows takes an unflinching look at the human cost of the U.S. Mexico drug war through the perspectives of three individuals: a U.S. drug enforcement agent on the border, an activist nun in violence-scarred Monterrey, Mexico, and a former Texas smuggler. The film reveals the human side of an often misunderstood conflict that has resulted in a growing human rights crisis. Stay tuned as we go center stage with Bernardo Ruiz, director of Kingdom of Shadows. Good evening, Bernardo, and welcome to Center Stage.
Great to be here.
Now tell me about the genesis of this film.
You know, I had been working on similar themed project in a previous documentary called Reportero, or The Reporter, which is about a journalist covering organized crime and political corruption in northern Mexico. And that was a kind of 2.5-year process. That film was eventually nominated for an Emmy, for a News and Documentary Emmy. But during the kind of production process, I started to hear about the issue of people being disappeared or taken in Mexico as a result of the drug violence there. And so I became very interested in that story. And basically that led to Sister Consuelo, who's one of the characters in the film. So that's kind of what kickstarted this process. But what I really wanted to do was just to make a film that would incorporate different perspectives. Because it's such a complex issue, I wanted to have 3 different points of view, and 3 really compelling points of view. And that's ultimately what I think I was able to do with the film is, weave together the stories of 3 different people that have been impacted by this conflict.
I saw in your film that, 23,000 people are disappeared in Mexico.
That's right, and according to Amnesty, that figure has actually gone up to 26,000, and those are the official figures. Many journalists and many human rights activists believe that number to be much higher. So it is a kind of it's a stunning number. It's a kind of horrific number when you think about it. And Sister Consuelo says in the film, many of the people who have disappeared or who have been disappeared are, innocents, people who have no ties to the drug trade whatsoever, but who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, mistaken for somebody who was involved. It's just that this general climate of insecurity has generated all this violence, and many people have unfortunately been swallowed up as a result of that violence.
Now, did you ever feel threatened because you're exposing this issue? Did you ever feel that your life might have been in danger, and were there situations that you felt compromised in any way?
I work with a very small team, and all of my collaborators are, it's 3 or 4 people depending on the shoot day. Everyone that I work with has experience working on these kinds of issues, and I also have learned from the previous film, from following the journalists, that you really can't work with security. There's no way that you can have an intimate interview or kind of gain intimate access as a filmmaker if you have an armed guard around. It's just not going to happen. So I've never worked in kind of that way with security, and but I do have the privilege. I'm a dual citizen. I live in the United States. I do have that privilege of leaving if things get complicated or difficult. And the people at the center of the film, in particular Sister Consuelo, she and the families that she's accompanying in her work, they're the ones who face the kind of greatest risk. Consuelo has been, she's had her life threatened, and for her work, and sometimes just trying to get institutions to work in parts of Mexico is a kind of radical proposition. And so she and the families are ultimately the one who kind of face the biggest danger for, exposing sometimes corruption and pushing authorities to do their jobs.
You've been making films since 1998. What did you learn about the process making Kingdom of Shadows?
I think this was the most ambitious project that I've undertaken, so far, and in part is because I was really influenced by kind of these big sweep novels, in particular, writers like Roberto Bolaño, who writes, at least his novels are these books made out of the voices of many different people, and they kind of have a cumulative effect on you. They kind of, work their magic over time. And I was really, I was inspired by that approach. And so what I wanted was this story to feel like a kind of a chorus of voices, and especially with this issue, with the organized crime issue or the narco issue. I don't think that it's a little bit like staring at the sun. You can't really do it for very long. You can't really get a frontal view of it very easily. But what you can do is see how it's impacted people and communities. And so, what I wanted to do was try to, tell a story through the fragments and how people have been impacted, and to hear lots of different perspectives. So I think for me, the lesson was in how to put all of these fragments together, how to tell a story through multiple voices, and ultimately kind of learn about how this kind of, this conflict has harmed so many people on both sides of the border.
How do you go about building up rapport so that you can get intimate conversations from your subjects?
With rapport, there's no real silver bullet, or I think it's really just time. It's a willingness to spend time with the participants in the film, and also to be transparent, to be honest. I mean, I do maintain a distance, and I maintain my editorial autonomy because I think that's important. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you're an automaton and you're not sharing things about yourself and who you are. And so that's always, I think, central to what we do in documentary, is how the type of relationship we foster with the person we're following or filming. And in each case, in this film, you have three people. You have a federal agent, Oscar Hagelsieb. You have a former drug smuggler, Don Henry Ford, who's kind of a cowboy smuggler, and Sister Consuelo, who's a nun and a human rights activist. And with each one of them, I really respected the logic of their perspective. I really, worked very hard to just try to see things from their point of view. And that's ultimately what I hope comes out in the film, is that each one of their points of view has validity, and each one of their experiences gets a certain kind of weight. And I think what that gives the viewer is gives the viewer a kind of bigger picture view, more than would be possible if it was just one perspective, one point of view.
What impressed you most about these people?
One of the things that I found fascinating about them is that they're kind of, they're larger than life figures in some ways. They're characters that I think they certainly defy stereotypes. Oscar Hagelsieb, if we meet him in the film, and a lot of people would look at him and think, he was a gang member or a biker. He's he's got tattoos up and down his arms, and he's a pretty tough looking character. But turns out that he's a high ranking Homeland Security agent. Same thing with Don Henry Ford. He looks like a kind of classic American cowboy, but was in fact working for one of the most ruthless organized crime groups in the 1980s in Mexico, the Juarez cartel. And even Consuelo, I think she defies stereotypes too, because on the surface she looks like a quiet sort of nun, but she's in fact a kind of arguably the bravest person in the film. She's the one who's pushing these public officials who don't always want to do their jobs to do what they're supposed to do, and that's a very dangerous proposition, as I mentioned before. So what I loved about all of them is that their stories are stranger than any fiction. If this had been a fictional film, I would be accused of inventing these outlandish stories, but in this case, these stories, these true testimonies, are much richer and more. I think they're more novelistic than a lot of fiction.
Did you have an intention with making Kingdom of Shadows, and if so, what was that?
I didn't have a political agenda, but I did have this goal of getting close to the three people, close enough to the three participants so that we could, through their stories, we could get a glimpse of this bigger picture issue, this narco conflict. I think that so much of the media around the narco conflict is really sensationalized, and it often, not always, but it often dehumanizes the people at the center of the conflict. Their series and their telenovelas and their big Hollywood movies, and even a few other documentaries that touch on this subject matter, But often I'm missing some context from those projects, and I certainly don't get a sense of the people at the center of this conflict. So what was most important to me was to try to spend time with three people who are also kind of great at sharing their testimony. And I think that's what you have in Consuelo and Oscar and Don, or they're three people who are kind of great narrators of their own lives.
Did you have any preconceived notions about the drug cartels or the drug wars? And when you started to go in and really sift through this material and learn about these people and this culture, did it change?
Yeah, I think like everyone else, I have my preconceived notions and biases. I mean, I think even, when I first met Oscar Hagelsee, the federal agent, I met him through two journalist friends in Texas. And, they didn't tell me what he looked like. In a way, they kind of played a trick on me. And I was at a cafe in El Paso waiting for what I thought a federal agent would look like. Like I was, waiting for a square-jawed guy in a suit, a very kind of particular look. And it was only afterwards that I realized, the person who I, was the least probable federal agent was in fact the federal agent. And I think when it comes to this issue, it comes to the drug war, things aren't always what they appear to be. And so I think there were many times along the way when I realized, this is, it's always more complex than you think it is, and and the truth is always more interesting than any kind of lazy fiction that you could come up with. People's stories often defy the tropes and the stereotypes, and that's always more interesting. I think it's more interesting as a filmmaker, definitely more interesting for an audience.
Well, with the way he presents himself, that was one of the reasons I believe from the film is how he was able to gain access to these drug dealers.
That's right. I mean, he leveraged his identity as, as a border person, as a Mexican American who grew up on the, in Socorro, which is a little town outside of El Paso, that was a staging ground for organized crime groups, for the Juarez cartel in particular. He grew up around a bunch of people who ended up going into organized crime. So he, in a way, it was like an acting role. He describes it very well in the film, that it's, you adopt this identity and the codes and you know how to talk the talk, and that allows you to infiltrate these organized crime groups. But obviously a very kind of harrowing situation, because at any moment, your identity could be compromised. And, again, here's someone whose personal life story is, richer and more fascinating than I think any kind of Hollywood fiction could come up with.
What was your biggest challenge in making this film?
The biggest challenge was really traveling between these three very different places that are also kind of connected in a way. So I was filming in El Paso, in the northern Mexican city of Monterrey, and out by San Antonio on Don Henry Ford's ranch, and just crossing the border, going back and forth often, and trying to kind of keep the whole thing together was a challenge, but it was a kind of a great challenge. And obviously security is an issue in parts of Mexico. I oftentimes think that Mexico is painted with one brush in the U.S. media, and obviously there are many Mexicos, just as there are many Americas in this country. But yeah, certainly in some of the places that we were filming, there was there were certainly some challenges, and always being aware of security is just something that's inevitable when you're filming in difficult areas.
What is that brush? Tell me about that. Tell me about the perspective that you find America has with this Mexican drug war.
Well, I think there's a funny relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. It's, I think of it as a kind of love-hate relationship, a kind of dysfunctional relationship. The two countries can't even agree on the name of the river that divides the two countries. In Mexico, it's the Rio Bravo, and here in the U.S., it's the Rio Grande. And there's really a kind of, sometimes kind of competing worldviews. At the same time, the two countries are deeply, deeply connected culturally, demographically, and then economically. And here in the U.S., we don't often hear about the kind of deep economic ties that the two countries have. I think most people don't know that Mexico is the third largest trading partner of the United States. It's like the second largest market for U.S. exports. So, the U.S. economy relies heavily on Mexico just on that level alone, nothing to say of the labor and people who live and work in the United States. So I think that complexity is really interesting, and I think it often gets ignored or flattened out by different media sources. And look, we're also in a moment in time where political pundits are using the U.S. Mexico border and or Mexicans as a kind of a punching bag to play to their bases. And I think while that riles people up, it doesn't really help people understand the reality of the connections between the two countries. To me, that's a more interesting place to tell stories. And I think it's a missed opportunity in a lot of media outlets to go deeper and to tell a kind of more sophisticated story.
And we're on the line with Bernardo Ruiz. He's the director of Kingdom of Shadows. Tell me about your process as a documentary filmmaker. Is there a specific structure that you have and you use that for each film that you make, or does it change and evolve?
I try to let the story itself, or the people that I'm following, dictate the structure. I mean, I like to think about it a little bit as like following the grain of wood. That if you're doing your job well as a documentarian, you're listening to what's happening, and you're following events as they're changing. At the same time, you have to be aware of how to give something shape, to not just sort of be totally acted upon by events and have no perspective. I'm very interested in kind of shaping the story, and providing analysis and a perspective. So it's that combination of improvisation and at the same time rigor. It's that tension that is really interesting in documentary. It's not like fiction where you can ostensibly control a set and direct actors and shape things in a very kind of concrete way. In documentary, we're obviously reacting to and events and improvising and going with the flow. At the same time, you're trying to keep a kind of hold on the story that you're trying to tell. That story can change, of course, but you're trying to shape the thing as it's happening. And I think that it's a very, as a filmmaker, as a writer, that's a very exciting proposition, because it's like this living, breathing thing. And when it works, it's thrilling.
Did you have a thesis going into the film? And when you started work on it, did it change?
Yeah, I really didn't have a thesis other than a desire to kind of spend time with these three voices, and but I was really open to letting them and their stories kind of lead me to where they were going to go. I think if a kind of thesis has come out of it, it's in part it's the kind of the harm that has been done by this conflict, and so I think sometimes some misguided policies. But I think more than a kind of a political story, it's really a story about how their lives have been impacted, and also just how the drug trade has changed. I think in the 1980s, when Don Henry Ford was smuggling kind of at the height of the Just Say No era, you could do business with a handshake, and he worked for different organized crime groups, and it was a very different type of trade, to today, which is hyper violent, and there are organized crime groups that have kind of wreaked havoc in entire regions in Mexico, fueled by U.S. dollars from U.S. consumption often. And if there was a kind of perspective or desire, was to kind of look at how things had changed, how they had gone from this different type of trade to this current type of drug business that's caused so much harm. Don Henry Ford's story is emblematic of a different era, totally in the drug business, and smaller players, less fragmentation, and less of the kind of huge sums of money that ended up changing the business. Some people would say that as Colombia, the country became less of an epicenter for a certain type of drug business, that Mexico took on this role. And as that happened, as more money started coming in, and certainly as you started having the involvement of security forces, then everything changed. And it is absolutely fascinating to have the perspective of someone like Don Ford, who lived through it, served time for smuggling, but survived the whole experience, and now has such a fascinating perspective on the whole business.
When you were working on the film, what was there something that really shocked you and disturbed you about this drug war?
There's an interview in the film that we obtained from a journalist colleague in the city of Monterrey. And it's an interview with a masked man who works for the Zetas, who are basically one of the more ruthless organized crime groups, and that's saying a lot. And in the interview, we hear him discuss how he dissolves bodies, how his job is to eliminate unwanted people for whatever reason, someone who saw the wrong thing, someone who's in the wrong place at the wrong time, someone who owed a debt, someone who was murdered to make a point, whatever the reason, his job is to dissolve those bodies. And he describes in detail what that entails. And I really struggled with whether or not to include that interview in the film. I think that oftentimes, again, as I said before, I think this is a topic that's been hyper sensationalized and really exploited. But I felt like in order for an audience to really understand the level to which things have sunk in parts of Mexico, and again, really tied to this kind of to U.S. consumption, that's really kind of made some of these organized crime groups so powerful. In order to understand that, we really need to hear from the darkness, from the shadows. And so, the interview is in the film. It's very disturbing. It's, the masked person tells us that there was a period where he couldn't eat chicken. He couldn't eat roast meat because the smell reminded him of the bodies he was burning. And, that's not something that you enjoy putting in a film. At the same time, if the goal is to kind of educate an audience and demonstrate how difficult things have become, then I felt like that. I personally felt like that was necessary to include. So that was a kind of dark realization, not something that was pleasant, but I felt like necessary to understanding what many communities in Mexico have had to live through.
But isn't it also necessary to build tension and to make your film even more compelling?
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of it, and I think the way I think of it is, in order for an audience, especially in the U.S., to understand what the families in Mexico are those who are searching for their loved ones, those who've disappeared, in order for someone stateside to understand, what the stakes are, you really need to know how serious the forces allied against them are. And I think that interview and that kind of understanding that really sharpens that for people. It gives them a kind of clear understanding of this is, what they're facing is very serious. And the consequences for them speaking up are extremely serious.
What would you like an audience to go away with after they see your film?
One thing that I'm excited about with this film is that I think it really generates different perspectives. I had a fascinating screening in El Paso where half the audience was made up of federal agents and the other half were progressive activists, people who work on immigration issues and human rights issues along the U.S. Mexico border. And, the conversation and the debate, heated as it was at times, it ensued, was just really kind of remarkable. And I think that, what I want a film like this to do is just to, show people that it's much more complex than people often think of. And I also think that, we need a more sophisticated, a more human conversation about the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. Certainly when it comes to, when we talk about who's been harmed in this conflict with, and under some egregious policies, communities on both sides of the border, whether it's people who've been harmed through addiction or incarceration in the United States, or communities that have been devastated and lost loved ones and, who've been kidnapped or tortured or murdered for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think we need to begin to have a kind of just a smarter, more humane dialogue.
Is that the objective of making film, is to create that dialogue and that discourse about social issues?
I am interested in the way that journalism and documentary kind of work together, and I am interested in informing an audience. At the same time, I want people to have a kind of emotional, visceral experience, and I want them to connect with the participants in the film, because I think that's really important. And again, one of the things I really wanted to do was to respect the logic of each character, each person, each voice in the film. So I want audiences to come out with a sense of how complicated it is, and I want them to spend time in the shoes of each one of the characters and to try to see this issue from their perspective.
What are the three most important elements of making a film?
I can't speak for all of filmmaking, but in my kind of humble little corner of the documentary world, I think the most important things are to really to kind of be true, to follow events and people, truthfully, even if we don't agree with them ideologically. I think that's really important.
Do you think that makes a better film when you don't agree with the person that you're the subject of your film?
I do, because I think that if first, how boring would it be if we were making films with about people we agreed with? That just becomes propaganda, and it would be lazy too. I think part of what's interesting is reporting against your assumptions. Having your assumptions challenged.
Can't you also spin it if you're interviewing someone that you despise? You can also spin it so it becomes propaganda.
There's always that risk, right? If you're checking yourself as much as possible. I mean, look, we're all biased and we all have our perspectives, but I do think there's a way in which you can safeguard against a lot of that by not trying to be manipulative, and again, by trying to respect the logic of the person that you're spending time with or interviewing. For instance, in the film, we have that interview with with this organized crime figure who's masked to protect his identity, and I clearly don't agree with that person's position or their job. At the same time, just letting that person speak reveals volumes about a situation. I don't have to tell them in an interview that what they're doing is wrong. That's not going to help the kind of public's understanding of this issue. Just putting it out there, is enough, I think.
Do you ever see yourself doing features, moving away from documentary and moving into features?
I think it's a really interesting time for documentaries. The audience appetite has really grown, and I think in some ways the kind of space that independent fiction films used to take, documentary has stepped into that space a little bit. Obviously, a lot of directors from the fiction world, from the independent feature world, have gone into television, to these great episodic dramas that we're seeing right now. Those of us making documentaries, and we're starting to see audiences, I think similar types of audiences that were interested in independent fiction or art house, films of the past. So I think, I'm kind of happy to be doing this type of documentary work right now. I would consider doing a fiction film if I'm most interested in stories that are kind of based on, original stories or reporting. So I think if there was some kind of story that fit that niche, I would certainly be interested in. That's also, I think, that's why someone would hire me, is because those are kinds of things that I'm interested in. But for now, I want to keep pushing on the documentary front. I think there's so many stories to be told, and I do think oftentimes these stories are more, they can be wilder and stranger in some ways than fiction.
Did you have a mentor starting out?
I've had a couple of mentors along the way. I would say that I think I've learned to do this as much as I'm able to do this through trial and error, and also just by starting off and working really pretty young. I did work in fiction film. I worked as a production assistant on Spike Lee's Clockers when I was like 19 or something, and I worked on short films, and but I was always really interested in how to kind of combine journalism and cinema, and just really learned by working with people like Orlando Bagwell, who was one of the original producers on Eyes on the Prize, or I think the second iteration of that, and working with a lot of people in kind of public media and documentary. But my school has really been just making the work itself.
You talk about trial and error. Tell me about a time that you tried something and it didn't work, and what happened, and how did you, let's say, get back on board? To what kind of corrections did you make so that you wouldn't do that same thing in the next film that you made?
It's a great question. Actually, when I started what ended up becoming the first documentary feature that I made was Reportero. What I originally wanted to do is I wanted to make a short film about this shelter for deported kids, basically deported children. And I just thought I was going to make a kind of quiet short film about this place that was receiving deported kids. And in about 2008 is when I started looking into it, maybe a little earlier. But when I got to the shelter in the city, this border city of Mexicali, that's when I started hearing about how people's lives have been impacted by this growing wave of violence. It made me realize that I didn't understand the context. I was going in with this kind of idea of what things were supposed to be or what they were supposed to look like. And that at that moment I realized, my job is really to listen and to pay attention to what's happening here on the ground, and to be responding rather than kind of imposing. It was that process of listening that eventually led me to the reporter character, the journalist, Sergio Ardo, who I ended up following for 2.5 years, and that became this film, that was nominated for an Emmy. It was on POV in 2013. So I think the lesson there, at least on the documentary side, is to just to follow the story, to not go in with such tightly held kind of ideas of what the film is supposed to look like, but to kind of let it flow. Just going back to what we talked about before, I think that the challenge is always in balancing that kind of openness with a kind of a vision, and that's the tension between the two is really what kind of, I think, makes for interesting documentaries.
Is there a through line, a specific through line that you look for in a project before you want to start? And if so, what is that? What is it that ultimately resonates with you as a filmmaker?
That's a good question. I try not to think too much about that through line, although I think sometimes it's there, and I try to be open, while at the same time understanding that there's probably, if you're being attentive and listening to the story, there's a kind of natural structure to it. And, again, people work in different ways, and some people do come in with a kind of very clear structure of what they want to do. The storytelling is so embedded in who we are that I think that if we're attentive, we can hear the kind of natural rhythms to a story and work from there.
For more on Center Stage, visit stageandscreen.com. And hey, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. Until next time, this is Mark Gordon, and I'll see you Center Stage.
Center stage, center stage, center, center, center stage. Center stage.
Center Stage is taped in front of a live studio audience.
Hello, this is Homer Simpson. Whenever I want to know what's going on in the entertainment world, I listen to Center Stage with Mark Gordon.